The day my wife moved into our quiet lake cabin was supposed to be peaceful, a fresh start away from noise and drama. We had just finished unloading the last box when I noticed a familiar figure standing near the property line, arms crossed, lips pursed. It was Karen, the HOA president, known for enforcing every rule like it was a federal law. I had expected a snide comment about parking or our porch light, but instead she pulled out her phone and began making a call. At first, I thought she was talking to another neighbor, but as I caught fragments of her words, unauthorized occupant, possible trespassing, I realized she was calling the police. My wife and I exchanged a look, confused and annoyed. We'd done nothing wrong. This was our home, and we didn't owe Karen an explanation. Minutes later, a patrol car rolled up the gravel drive. The officer stepped out, his eyes scanning the cabin and then landing on my wife. Karen immediately stormed forward, her voice loud enough for half the street to hear. She demanded that my wife prove she belonged here, and insisted she was. Breaking HOA residency rules, my wife stayed calm, reaching into her bag. Karen's smug grin grew, certain she'd caught us in some violation. But when my wife pulled out a small leather wallet and flipped it open, the color drained from Karen's face. She stepped back, silent for the first time all day, and that's when the real story began. Karen's sudden silence was almost unsettling. This was the same woman who once argued with a delivery driver for 5 straight minutes because his truck's tires touched the HOA-maintained curb. Now, she stood frozen, eyes locked on the small badge in my wife's hand. The officer glanced at it, gave a subtle nod, and his entire demeanor shifted. He stepped back, respectful, and addressed my wife in a calm tone. My wife had spent years serving in the military, just recently in a position that required a high-level clearance. That ID wasn't just plastic and lamination, it carried weight. But Karen didn't know the details, and I wasn't about to give her a free briefing. The shock on her face told me she was putting together the pieces on her own, and for the first time, she seemed unsure about her next move. Still, the history between us wasn't something that would disappear overnight. For months, Karen had made it her mission to protect the neighborhood from anything she didn't personally approve of. She'd filed petty complaints about the color of my shutters, the placement of my woodpile, even the fact that I had a flagpole in the yard. This was more than a misunderstanding, it was a pattern. The officer turned to Karen, asking her to clarify why she had called in the first place. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, glancing between us. Something about my wife's calm, steady gaze kept her from spitting out the accusations I knew were sitting on the tip of her tongue. Karen shifted uncomfortably under the officer's questioning. But her pride wouldn't let her walk away. She started talking about security concerns and maintaining HOA standards, avoiding eye contact with my wife. The officer listened but kept glancing back at the military ID, as if silently reminding Karen she might be treading on thin ice. What she didn't know was that my wife had already done background checks, not the invasive kind, but enough to understand the power plays happening within the HOA. Karen had recently pushed for new rules about approved residents, claiming it was for safety. In reality, it gave her leverage to pry into everyone's personal life. Several neighbors had quietly complained about her late-night inspections and unannounced visits. But nobody wanted to challenge her openly. As the officer took notes, I noticed another movement across the street. One of the other HOA board members stood by their mailbox, pretending to sort letters, but clearly listening in. It wasn't just curiosity, there was a quiet, calculated interest in their eyes. It made me wonder if this confrontation wasn't just about my wife at all, but part of something bigger within the HOA itself. The officer asked Karen again if there had been any actual violation, something concrete he could address. She hesitated, then muttered something about unverified residency. My wife didn't react, just kept that calm. unshakable expression that had probably disarmed more dangerous situations than this. Karen's hands were clenched now, her voice tight, and I could feel it. She wasn't done yet. Karen took a step closer, lowering her voice like she didn't want the officer to hear, but still loud enough for me and my wife to catch every word. "I'll be watching," she said, her tone dripping with warning. My wife didn't flinch, but I could see that flicker of tension in her jaw, the kind that meant she was cataloging every detail for later. The officer, sensing the temperature rising, reminded us all that this was a civil neighborhood matter and not a criminal one, at least for now. But Karen wasn't letting go. She circled back to her favorite topic, HOA Authority. She started talking about fines, surprise inspections, and further action if we didn't comply with the new rules. It was less about safety and more about control, and everyone standing nearby knew it. The neighbor at the mailbox edged closer, clearly invested in the showdown. I caught a quick glance between them and Karen, like there was some unspoken alliance at play. That's when I realized the tension here wasn't just between Karen and us. It was tied into a larger HOA power struggle. My wife's presence and that military ID had just disrupted something they'd been building quietly behind the scenes. Karen's voice rose again, her words sharp, and the officer had to step between us. But even as he spoke, I noticed the board member across the street pulling out a phone, pointing it our way. Whether they were recording evidence or intimidation, I didn't know, but it meant this wasn't going to end here. The board member across the street kept filming, but then something strange happened. They put the phone down, answered a call, and their entire expression changed. They glanced toward us, then toward the end of the street, as if something urgent was approaching. Karen noticed it too. Her posture stiffened, and for the first time that day, she looked nervous. A low hum in the distance grew louder, and soon a black SUV rolled slowly into view. It wasn't a neighbor's vehicle, and it didn't look like it belonged in our quiet lakeside community. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. The SUV stopped right in front of our cabin, engine still running. Karen's bravado wavered. She glanced at the board member, who suddenly looked like they regretted being there. The officer stepped back slightly, keeping his eyes on the vehicle. My wife's hand instinctively brushed against her bag, where her military ID was still tucked away. Then the back window of the SUV rolled down just a few inches, enough for a voice to carry across the yard. It called out Karen's name. The tone was calm, but it had an authority that made her freeze mid-step. She didn't answer, just stood there, caught between us and whatever was inside that SUV. The voice spoke again, this time asking, "Is there a reason you're interfering with military personnel?" The entire street went silent. Even the board member stopped fidgeting. Karen's face paled, and I realized this was no ordinary visitor. Karen stammered, searching for words, but nothing came out. The officer turned toward the SUV, clearly as curious as the rest of us. Slowly, the back door opened, and a man in a crisp dark suit stepped out. He wasn't law enforcement, at least not the kind we usually saw, was no badge on display, but his presence carried weight. He walked past the officer and stopped directly in front of Karen. "I suggest you think very carefully before you answer my question," he said evenly. My wife stood still, watching, but I could tell she recognized something about him, maybe his bearing, maybe his tone. Karen's voice finally cracked, muttering something about neighborhood rules and keeping order. But the man cut her off. "This property and its occupants are not under your jurisdiction," he said firmly. "And any further harassment will be documented and handled appropriately." Karen's face burned red, but she said nothing. The board member took a half step back, clearly wanting no part of this anymore. The man gave my wife a nod and returned to the SUV without another word as the vehicle pulled away. Karen tried to recover, muttering that this wasn't over. But her voice lacked conviction. The officer quietly told her to head home. And she did, without looking back. When I turned to my wife, she gave me a small smile. "Funny," she said. "I didn't tell you he's an old contact from my service days." And just like that, I knew Karen's game had ended before it even began. The SUV's taillights faded into the curve of the road, leaving the street quiet again. The officer gave us a short nod, his expression saying more than words could, then left without another word. The board member lingered for a moment, clearly debating whether to apologize or just disappear. In the end, they muttered a quick goodnight and hurried away, leaving us alone on the porch. Inside the cabin, the air felt lighter. My wife set her bag on the table and sank into the chair by the window, looking out at the dark water of the lake. I could see the relief in her eyes, but also a quiet satisfaction. Whatever Karen had planned, it had just been dismantled in front of the entire neighborhood. Over the next few days, word spread quickly. Neighbors stopped by with knowing smiles, a few even admitting they'd been on the receiving end of Karen's HOA Authority before. The board member resigned from their position, citing personal reasons, and the HOA suddenly became much quieter.